Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Eric Jay Dolin. Eric is a graduate of Yale and MIT, where he received his PhD in environmental policy and planning. He's worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service, the US EPA, and the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. He's published more than 60 articles for magazines, newspapers, and journals, and he's the author of numerous books on topics such as the fur trade, whaling, lighthouses, pirates, and hurricanes. He joins me today for a discussion of his most recent book called Left for Dead: Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. Eric, thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
So you grew up along the Atlantic coast in the New York, Connecticut regions, and I'd like to ask you first how you developed your passion for the natural world as a kid.
Yeah, I grew up, I was born in Queens, which isn't really pretty built up. And I left there when I was 4, went to Long Island. And then when I was in high school, I went to Stamford, Connecticut. So I lived on the edge of Long Island Sound, and I got really into seashells when I was a little kid. And I dreamed of growing up and becoming Jacques Cousteau because I used to watch all of his specials, and I spent a lot of time down at the beach and I collected shells. It got so serious that by the time I was a senior in high school, I wrote a 150-page paper on the mollusks of Long Island Sound. And 2 chapters of that got published in a magazine called Of Sea and Shore. And that was one of my earliest publications. I was writing other stuff while I was in high school, op-eds, humorous pieces, but I often had an environmental or biological bent. And then right before I went off to college, I was the seaside naturalist for the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, where I got to teach little kids about nature and the ocean. So I loved all that stuff. And I went off to college. I went to Brown University, all excited. I was going to be a biology major and focus on marine biology. After a couple of years, I realized that I wasn't that good in chemistry or physics, or particularly lab work that I would probably have to do to be a good marine biologist. I actually spent a summer working at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. I spent a summer working at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. So I know a lot about biology, and I know sort of what it takes to be a biologist. But by the time I was a junior, I decided that I wasn't going to be Jacques Cousteau, even though I did get my scuba diving license, and I had to pivot to something else. So a lot of my background involved the natural world, and environmental studies seemed to be a natural connection because I could do policy work, which I was good at, policy analysis, and I could still focus on the environment to some extent. So I double majored in biology and environmental policy, and then I continued on. At this point, I said, I wanted to be a professor of environmental policy. But 2 degrees later, a master's degree at Yale and a PhD at MIT beat that out of me. I decided I didn't want to be an academic because I didn't really enjoy the writing that I would have to do to get tenure as an academic. So I graduated from MIT with an environmental policy PhD, and I didn't apply for a single teaching job. Instead, I started working for various government, nonprofit organizations, doing a variety of environmental policy. And then 10 years later, I suddenly discovered that, I really don't love all these jobs. Some of them were quite boring. Some of them I was working with people I really didn't like. But mainly what I loved was writing. I was always writing on the side. I'd started writing books. So in 1999, I told my wife I wanted to be a full-time writer. And she's very supportive. And she said, fine, but first you have to put aside a year's worth of your salary before you quit your job. So from 1999 to about 2007, I continued writing books, writing articles, putting aside money. She manages all the money in the family. And so I really didn't know where I was in terms of meeting my goal, but she had been ferreting away some money every year on my behalf. And in the summer of 2007, she said to me, you can quit your job and be a writer. I said, okay. And it took me about 4 weeks before I quit my job. And I've been a full-time writer ever ever since. But one thing I didn't say is I went from EPA. I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency, and Jen said, my wife, Jen said, she said, well, before going off and being a writer, why don't you try writing for the federal government? So I actually got a job as an accident report writer for the National Transportation Safety Board in Washington, D.C. Horrible job that's quickly spurred my desire to leave the government. I love a lot of people. Listen, especially in this fraught time, government's very important. I'm a big supporter of it. I don't like what's happening to it right now. And however, I do think there are a number of people that that we could right size some of these government agencies. And a lot of my friends work in government agencies. They do really great work. And it was just that I wasn't a good fit for the kind of work I was doing for a variety of reasons. And that sort of propelled my desire to leave the government and become a writer. So I've been doing that for, boy, it's 13, 18 years now. And so far it's worked out.
That sounds like a great story to me. And
Yeah,
and you're
somebody said to me the other day, I was giving a talk at a literary festival, and I was giving some of my background, and they said, you should write a biography, your memoir. And I immediately responded, I am not famous enough or interesting enough to write a memoir, but a lot of people have been mentioning that. So maybe if I run out of ideas, I should write a memoir. Maybe a memoir of somebody who's not a celebrity will strike a chord, because I've done a lot of different things in my life.
that your latest book, the one we're going to talk about today, Left for Dead, it's about uh, an American sealing vessel and a shipwrecked British brig, British warship that all meet in the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. It ended with 3 British sailors and 2 Americans who were marooned on the Falkland Islands for nearly a year and a half. So to go over some of the background leading up to this incident that happens there, could we start with sealing in the late 18th century and early 19th century? How important was sealing to people at that time?
Sealing was a pretty major industry. It wasn't as big as the whaling industry, either in the United States or in other countries, but it was a not too distant second from the late 1700s through the early 1800s, roughly till about 1820. There were a great number of sealing vessels going down to the South Atlantic, going to the Pacific, anywhere there were fur seals and hair seals, like sea lions. Excuse me. So in America, there was a great desire to branch out after the American Revolution and, find ways to make money. So one of the things that quickly became apparent is that there was a market in China for, excuse me, I have allergies. That's what's coughing me. Oh, I didn't get more water. Sorry. But anyway, there was a desire in China for these fur seals. They love sea otter pelts, which are very valuable. Fur seals and hair seal pelts were much less valuable. You could get about $100 for a sea otter pelt, but for a fur seal and a hair seal pelt, you might only get 25 cents to $5. Yet, if you had a high enough volume of pelts to sell, it started to be real money. And between the late 1700s and the early 1800s, somewhere in the order of 2.5 million to 3.5 million seals were slaughtered throughout the world. And most of those pelts went to China, where they were sold in markets to people who wanted capes and gloves and mittens and things like that, and shoes, types of shoes. So it was a fairly large industry. There were dozens of American ships that were involved in it, and one of those was the one in Left for Dead, the Nanina, that left from New York right before the War of 1812 started. And the thing is, the Nanina did or planned to do what many other American sealing vessels did, is they not only killed seals for their pelts, but they also killed elephant seals, which have a lot of blubber on them. They don't have any fur, but they have a lot of blubber, and they would melt down that blubber just like they melted down the blubber of whales to make a very high quality aluminant that was second only to sperm whale oil in terms of its value and its ability to burn cleanly without too much smoke. So the Nina left in June or no, April of 1812 to head down to the Falkland Islands, and they hoped to return to New York after a year with a lot of fur seal and hair seal pelts and some sea elephant oil, and then continue sealing and take the remainder of their spoils all the way to Canton, China, which today is Guangzhou, China. But a lot of other things happened to intervene, and their sealing voyage was interrupted, and thus they created the story that became the basis for the book.
Hmm. So the captain of the Nanina was someone named Charles Barnard. Is that the
Yes,
right
Charles Barnard.
pronunciation? Charles Barnard.
Yes, yes,
And he also had other captains aboard with him.
yeah.
There were three other captains on board with him?
There are four. There were four other captains, including his father. Yeah, it was. That's not a good mix. A lot of them were unemployed because the lead up to the War of 1812. And anybody who knows anything about maritime history knows that captains of vessels are sort of like they're the last word when they're out in the ocean. So having five chiefs on one vessel was partially a recipe for disaster, and it ended up being a little bit of a problem who was in charge and who was listening to the orders. So yeah, there were five captains total on board, including Charles Barnard's father. Maybe it's four captains. I don't know. Another thing about writing so many books, I've written 16 books, and I know Left for Dead is my last one, but I just handed in another book about a month ago. Totally different topic. It also involves the Pacific Ocean. But one of the problems of jumping around to different topics is even I forget the details of some of my books. So forgive me if I say something that's not reflected in Left for Dead. I only wrote the book. I don't know everything that's in it.
No problem. Yeah, I understand. And you've also written about whaling in the past. In terms of like ship size and crews and all of that, the logistics of doing this work, how did a sealing vessel and its work compare to a whaling vessel?
Sailing vessels are usually smaller than whaling vessels. They also are more lightly crewed. A sailing vessel may be a 40, 50-foot vessel, a little bit larger. It might have 10 people on board, 8, 12, 14, or 15. Whaling vessels by this time were starting to get much bigger, 70, 80, 90 feet, 100 feet or more. They had more equipment on board in general, and they probably had slightly larger crews. It could be 20, 25 people on board, because they would send out, usually a good size whaling vessel would send out 4 whale boats, each with 5 to 6 men on board, just to chase the whales. And then they would have the people who remained back on the vessel. But when you were a sealer, you would go to an island where the sealing was going to take place, and you go ashore and basically set up tent, set up a camp, and you do small sealing operations from there, either rowing or sailing around the islands, looking for where the seals were, and then killing them, stripping them of their skins, bringing those skins back to the mother ship, pegging them out on land so they could dry to a cardboard or wood-like consistency, and then placing them in uh, the hold of the ship for the long journey to wherever they were going.
If we went to the Falkland Islands at the beginning of the 19th century, what would we see if we were there?
Uh, if you went to the Falkland Islands at the beginning of the 19th century, you'd see a lot of birds, a lot of seals, a lot of penguins, a lot of nothing, in the sense of there are no trees on any of the islands at that point. So it was very flat. There were a lot of bushes. There were a lot of grasses that were there that grew quite large. But at the time that the Nanina got to the Falklands, there wasn't a single person there. In prior decades, there had been small colonies of Spaniards, Argentinians, French, and British. But by the time the Nanina got there in 1812, they had all vacated the premises, and the entire archipelago, some 700 islands, 200 of which were more than mere specks, was completely uninhabited by humans. But there were foxes, the Falkland fox, which became extinct due to overhunting in the 1860s. There were numerous waterfowl. There were penguins. There were all the seals. There were whales offshore. I mean, it's a very vibrant ecological community that they entered.
And after the American Revolution, how did that change England's use of the land that we now call Australia?
After the American Revolution, well, my Australian history is not as good as my American history, but basically what happened, and I talk about this in the book, the most interesting thing is that England was running out of space for all of the people that had convicted of various crimes, petty and major. They used to dump a lot of their convicts and felons on the American colonies, but with the end of the American Revolution, that pipeline was pretty much shut off. So they had to find another way to house their felons. And what they decided to do first was to put them in large warships offshore near London or off the coast. But quickly those became overcrowded. There was a lot of pestilence. It was a really difficult environment to keep people in. So they elected to use Australia as their dumping ground, New South Wales as their dumping ground. And starting in the 1780s, late 1780s, and ramping up thereafter, an increasing number of prison convoys of ships would be going down to Sydney Harbor or Port Jackson Harbor at the time, and they would deposit their criminals, and the criminals would populate Australia. And I think Australians today are quite proud of that past, perhaps. At the time, people in Britain certainly looked down on Australia and the kind of people that were there, but that's how it was being populated at the time.
So we talked about the Nanina. It sailed from the Atlantic coast of the United States and was down in the Falkland Islands, and they were busy working there, killing seals and preparing their furs for storage and then later market. So the next ship is called the Isabella, and it leaves from the Australian coast and goes around South America, and it, due to having a alcoholic captain, shipwrecks in the Falkland Islands. And were they there before the Nanina? The Isabella shipwreck?
No, they got there after. The Nanina got there in September of 1812, and the Isabella got there on February 8th of 1813. And for a number of months, they were there alone. They didn't know anything about the Nanina, and the Nanina knew nothing about them. The people on the Isabella actually used their 17-foot longboat to send off on a rescue mission that ultimately made it to Buenos Aires to get another British ship to come rescue them. But while that ship was away trying to get a rescue, the Nanina was doing some sealing not far from the island where the British people crashed. And the Americans came upon these, I think there were, how many were there? More than 50 people at the time who were on the Isabella, and the people of the Nanina came upon them, and they agreed to rescue them. They agreed to cut short their sealing voyage as long as they could have the rights to all of the cargo and salvage of the wrecked Isabella minus personal possessions. And then they would take all the people on the Isabella, who are now castaways, to the nearest port in South America or possibly to the United States so they could there make it further on back to London. And the people of the Isabella agreed to this arrangement, and everybody was happy for a while. But then, while they were in the midst of preparing to leave the islands, the Nancy, a British warship, was sent to rescue the castaways of the Isabella. And that's where the real problems started. Actually, there were some other problems before that.
People of the Isabella did not know that the War of 1812 had started, but the Nanina had heard word of this, and before they came to these terms that the Nanina would rescue the crew, they informed them that actually our countries are officially at war right now. Do you still want to go through with this?
Right. And they agreed and they said, yes, because you're doing the humanitarian thing. You're doing the right thing. You're offering to save us. Despite the fact that we are now at war, this is a different situation and a different set of circumstances.
One of the, and on the Isabella, there were women and children, or at least
Right.
women
There's
as well,
one,
right?
yeah, there were some children, young people, and then there was one that was born there on the Falklands, perhaps the first European born on the Falklands. But there were some other people that were, 8, 12 years old. So it wasn't all adults. It was a lot of people were leaving Australia to go back to England after serving out their term, if they were felons, or maybe they were pardoned and they were allowed to go back to England. And then there were some 14 armed Marines who were going back to London for some rest and relaxation.
Hmm. So next, what happens is Barnard and on their small boat, they take some of a few of the British people with them, and they go back to their main ship to inform them of the new plan. And then their plan is to take all of their ship and cargo back to the Isabella wreck and load everything up and then take them to South America somewhere. And while this is happening, the Nancy, captained by someone named Duranda, it arrives at the Isabella shipwreck site,
Yeah.
Eagle Island. And so then over at the Nanina, what happens over there? Let's say that first.
Well, the Nanina, Charles Barnard with some of his men and a bunch of the British, including many of the British Marines, was over at the Nanina getting it ready to leave and go pick up the people at Eagle Island and go back to South America. Well, the British got rather impatient, and despite the bad weather, they didn't want to wait, as Barnard did, for the bad weather to clear. And Barnard finally convinced them that it'd be a good idea to wait a little bit because the winter is rather harsh and they might not make it back to Eagle Island and the Nina. But then they were running out of food, so Barnard suggested going for a hunt in a nearby Beaver Island. They were on New Island, and they were going to take a small boat over to Beaver Island and hunt for hogs, which had been placed there decades before by earlier mariners, and birds, and then bring them back. So at first, the British said, no, we can't wait. We've got to go back to Eagle Island right away. Barnard calmed them down. He asked for volunteers to go on the hunting trip. 3 British sailors and 1 American volunteered. They were going to be away just for a couple of days. And Barnard left with his dog Scent and the other 4 men going to Beaver Island, hunting for all these animals. He thought everything was fine. When he came back 2 days later, the British, in the meantime, had rose up and demanded that the remaining Americans take the Nanina all the way to Eagle Island. And the one American captain knew something that the British didn't, which is that the waters off of the Falklands are extremely hazardous. So he struck a deal with the British. He said, I will con the ship. I will sail the ship from here, they're about 80 miles away, to Eagle Island to pick up all the remaining British passengers. However, to do that, I have to have you agree that we will stop on the way at Beaver Island and pick up the hunting party, since you don't want to wait for them to return. The British agreed to this deal, but then when the Nanina came abreast of Beaver Island, the British reneged on the deal, and all they agreed to do was fire off two guns. They didn't agree to stop. They didn't send a ship ashore to find the hunting party, which unfortunately for the hunting party was on the other side of Beaver Island at the time. So they just sailed on, and the Americans couldn't do anything but seethe. And one of the Americans on board was Valentine Barnard, which was Charles Barnard's dad. And he was particularly upset about leaving his son behind and the other men. But the ship then went off to Eagle Island and left the hunting party behind.
And Duranda, the captain of the Nancy, he immediately declared this a spoil of war, that this now belonged to him and his crew, the Nanina.
Yeah, he claimed the Nanina and the shallop, the Nanina's small boat, as a prize of war, and all of the Americans as prisoners of war, despite the agreement that the castaways, the British castaways, had reached with the Americans for their salvation. He basically ripped up that agreement in effect, and he said, I don't care. It's a time of war. This is a prize of war. And his motivation, of course, I think, was because when you are during times of war back then and you captured a foreign ship as a prize of war, the people who captured it got the benefit of the sale of the ship and the cargo. So Duranda viewed this not only as a feather in his cap as a military commander who had thus far had a relatively lackluster military career, but he also viewed the Nanina and all of its pelts, which it had about 15,000 pelts on board already. He viewed all of them as potential money in his pocket.
And did they head for Rio de Janeiro? Is that where they went next?
Yeah, well, first the Americans who were prisoners of war begged Duranda to go back to Beaver Island to pick up the hunting party, but he refused for 3 weeks. Finally, he consented, but instead of sending one of the Americans who knew his way around the Falklands to go back to Beaver Island, he sent a few other people who knew nothing about the area. They only went about 25 miles away instead of the 85 or so miles they would have to go to retrieve the hunting party. And they came back empty-handed. And Duranda and the British decided to leave with the Nanina in the end of July of 1813. In the meantime, Charles Barnard and the other hunters had tried valiantly to get back to Eagle Island to catch up with the British who they thought were there, but they were unsuccessful. So they had to make camp on Swan Island as the British took off. And the British they could have gone by Beaver Island and seen if the hunting party was there, but they didn't do that. Instead, the Nanina was supposed to sail to London, and the Nancy, which was the British warship, was supposed to go to Rio de Janeiro. But because of bad weather and a lack of food and water, the Nanina ended up going to Buenos Aires, and then Rio de Janeiro. The Nanina went to Rio de Janeiro. The Nancy went to Buenos Aires, where where the commander who had sent the Nancy down to get the British castaways was stationed. And then Duranda went on to Rio de Janeiro, where he was shocked to see the Nanina in port. He thought it should have been in London. So then some interesting things happened at that point as well.
Why do you suppose they were so reluctant to go pick up those 5 marooned sailors? 3 of them were their own British citizens.
That's a very good question. Nobody ever gave a good answer in the records that are available. I think Duranda was a bit of a miserable person, to be honest, and was not very reasonable and felt he needed to get back as soon as possible and not mess around in the Falklands and possibly crash trying to save these five people. I can't, I don't know what other reason there would be. There are some of the accounts said that the British claimed that Barnard had been a really bad person. But based on what I saw that actually happened, I don't think that was the case. I just think it was a very poor and morally reprehensible decision to leave without picking up the hunting party. Maybe there's a secret there that someday somebody will find, but I don't know what good reason there could be for not making a serious attempt to try to save the hunting party.
Hmm. So this hunting party, they realize they're stranded there, and they're stranded there for a long time, and they have to survive in quite bleak conditions. But what's available to them for hunting? We said they have hogs there. There are also a number of different birds. I think I remember reading in the book they ate albatross eggs and penguin eggs. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, luckily back then there was no concern about cholesterol because these guys ate a lot of bird eggs, and these are big eggs. But their main source of food were the hogs that they were able to catch with the help of the dog scent, Charles Barnard's dog. They also caught a lot of waterfowl using snares. They occasionally ate fish, but not much. And they didn't seem to have an affinity for seal meat, which was very plentiful. They ate it on occasion, but they really didn't like it. And then they were able to heat their fires using the peat that was under the tussock grass, which is this very tall, long growing grass that develops a very thick layer of organic peat beneath the heads of it. And it's very high in organic content, and they could burn that and cook food. So they weren't so bad off. There were a couple of potatoes that were left from earlier mariners. They didn't have a lot of green stuff. That was unfortunate, but they had enough to survive.
And what were the conditions that made it difficult to survive? And the climate, rats bothered them.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
there were a lot of rats. They had this rat camp at one point. Yeah, there were a lot of rats that bothered them that would eat their food if they didn't sort of keep it away from them. It's a very cold environment. It's a very windy environment. In the summer, the average temperature is 49 degrees. In the winter, the average temperature is 36 degrees. But if you take into account the average wind speed year round of about 18 miles per hour, you realize that this is a very cold, this is a very cold environment. And there wasn't a single tree to break the wind. So it was a very hostile environment to live in. Ultimately, for a time, they lived under the overturned boat, but then they built out of peat and other materials, ribs of whales, and occasional pieces of wood. They built a small sort of hut that they could be shielded from the wind and the worst of the weather. And they ended up surviving for 534 days.
and for some of those days, Charles Barnard was on his own. What were the circumstances that led to him being on his own for, I think, a few months?
Yeah, it was a few months. Well, basically, he didn't get along too well. There was this guy, Samuel Ansell, who was a British sailor who was there. He seemed to be a born troublemaker from even before he went off with the hunting party. And he got crossways with Charles Barnard, and he basically convinced the other people to leave Barnard all alone on New Island, making him truly an American Robinson Crusoe. But he was really the master of survival. And they actually took his dog as well, and they took everything he owned, which wasn't much, his flints and other stuff. So he survived fine for 2 months, but they didn't survive too well. They tried to make it back to the crash of the Isabella site to get some more items from that. And they finally came back about 2 months later, begging Barnard to take them back into the fold. And he, being a religious man, and also, I think, desirous of getting his dog back and having some human company, he agreed as long as they maintained good behavior. But this guy, Samuel Ansell, couldn't keep to his pledge to be a good fellow. And finally, the other four people ganged up on Samuel Ansell and sent him to his own island, a nearby island. And then they finally reconciled a few weeks later or a few months later after he finally and completely agreed to be a good person. And he maintained his word and his behavior after that.
They were there stranded for just about 18 months before someone came along and discovered them and brought them back to safety. So how long did it take before Charles actually made it back home to America?
The men weren't retrieved by these two British whaling ships until 534 days after they were abandoned as part of the hunting party. But then it took Charles almost another couple of years to make it back, because he had to go along, just like the other men. They had to go along with these whaling ships and make it into South American ports or Chinese ports and try to find an American ship to hop onto. And then it took many, many months just to sail back from Canton, which is where Barnard sailed back from, to make it back to the United States. But he had many different adventures, but they didn't have cell phones back then. They didn't have good postal service. So the owners of the Nanina and his family knew nothing about his whereabouts for many years. They thought he was dead. And then he shows up like back from the dead, and everybody was very happy. And the owners finally got the story of what happened down in the Falklands to this hunting party.
And Charles eventually went back out to sea again. I'm wondering if I could have your insights into after someone goes through an ordeal like this, they still continue going out and risking their lives doing this work. What do you think keeps dragging people like Charles back out to sea?
In his case, I think it was the need for money. It was the thing that he was most skilled at. He did end up, I think, for a little while in debtor's prison because he came back without a penny to his name and a busted trip. And the thing that he was good at up until that point, and even with this experience, was being captain of a sealing vessel. And if he went on a successful voyage, he could make some fairly good money and rehabilitate himself, in effect. It's sort of like a plumber. If you're a plumber or you're a writer or whatever profession you have, probably the best shot you had at making a living is pursuing the profession that you were trained for. So I think a lot of these mariners, they really loved what they did in a perverse sense, even though it was kind of a miserable job and very difficult, but they were very good at it. And he had done it for many times. And it was probably the single thing that he had the greatest opportunity to recoup some of his fortune, because job opportunities, he wasn't trained, to be a physician or a lawyer or an investment banker, the type that they had back then. So this is really probably his best chance to make money.
As my final couple of questions, I'd like to ask you, first of all, if you did any interesting travel during the research of writing this book.
No, here's where I disappoint people. Basically, when I started writing books, I had to go to special libraries to get information. Getting information is so much easier nowadays because so many libraries, historical societies have digitized their holdings, and books that were written in the 1800s are easily accessible online. So all of the research I had to do, I didn't need to go anyplace. In the past, I've gone to England quite a few times to use the National Archives, but I didn't need to go there for this because all of the documents, including the court case that resulted from the seizure of the Nanina, were available through the National Archives, and I could, for a small amount of money, get PDFs sent to me of the original documents. As to going to the Falklands, well, I have to admit the Falklands is not high on my bucket list of places I wanted to go to. And to go to the Falklands from Massachusetts, where I live, is quite expensive. And I realized early on that going to the Falklands and walking around and seeing where these men were really wouldn't give me much greater of a feel for what it was like, because I had some very good accounts from mariners, including Charles Barnard, of what the Falklands felt like in the early 1800s. So I instead relied on the people that had experienced it at the time of the story, as opposed to having me go there now and try to recreate in my mind what it must have been like. Now, I'll be honest, if I had unlimited funding, I probably would have hopped on a plane and gone to the Falklands. But as a writer, I don't. So I didn't. And I told the people, I once was interviewed by Falklands TV, and I don't know, probably 6 people were listening to me. It's a small, only about 5,000 people in the Falklands. But I said that if all the people in the Falklands bought a copy of my book and the book did really, really well, I'd come visit the Falklands. Well, the book's done well, but I am sure that they did not all buy copies of the book. So as of right now, I am not going to the Falklands.
The last question I'd like to ask you is about coming up with the title of the book. When in the process of writing this did you settle on the title and subtitle that you came up with?
It wasn't until the end. It was after I had finished the draft and I sort of thought about, like, I just had to come up with a title for my new book. I have multiple options that I need to discuss with my publisher. But when I finished writing Left for Dead and it sort of was with my editor being edited, that's when I started thinking about um, what title would work best. And just Left for Dead, I had a couple of titles. I can't remember what the other ones were. But Left for Dead just struck me as that's what they were left for dead in effect. And I thought it was a dramatic title. You try to pick a title that encapsulates what's in the book, but also will grab attention, just like you try to pick a cover image that'll grab attention. And Left for Dead, you know, shipwreck, treachery, and survival at the edge of the world, I think really captured in very summary form, the scope of the book, but also was sort of a dramatic title. I mean, I can't name every book, you know, Bloody Death or something, you know. You must read this book.
Great. Well, I enjoyed reading the book and getting to
Thanks.
know this story from the early 19th century that I had never heard of before.
Yeah, me either.
So I
Yeah.
also really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. I enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you for asking me. And yeah, it was fun. And now I'm off to my next topic. I have to come up with a new book idea. I sort of jump around a lot, but it's fun. It's the best job I've ever had, but also one of the most difficult.